elegant setting. Our society is celebrating Churchill's 150th birthday with many events throughout the English-speaking world, from Australia to Great Britain to Canada and throughout the United States. We hosted our annual Churchill birthday dinner this past December at the Sarasota Yacht Club, which featured Justice Denneke, New College's Emeritus Professor of History, discussed Churchill, the World War I Paris Peace Treaty, and the rise of Bolshevism. In January, Professor Denneke returned right here on campus, in this room, for a free-flowing book forum, as we read and discussed a chapter from his book on FDR's foreign policy as it related to Sir Winston. Last month in downtown Sarasota, for our Chapter 2nd event of 2024, we had an amazing live hookup from London with renowned Professor David Reynolds, who chatted to our chapter about his just-published new Churchill book, Mirrors of Greatness. All of our events would not be possible without the help of our hard-working committee chairs, and I would like to specifically ask our event planner, Garnett Black, to stand. Please give her a hearty welcome for all the hard work that she has done to put this event together. It's a distinct pleasure for me to introduce next Lee Pollock. Many of you know Lee from the wonderful talk he gave to us last spring on Churchill and his visits to Florida and Cuba. Lee is the former executive director of our International Churchill Society. When not lecturing on Churchill, Lee is on the board of directors of our society, a fellow of the National Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri, and recipient of our ICS's Chartwell Award. Please give a warm welcome to Lee, who drove here from Palm Beach, and he will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Gene, and I bring you all greetings from Fulton, Missouri, where I was this past weekend at America's National Churchill Museum, with which the Churchill Society has a close and very productive relationship. And thank you, Gene, and all the board members here, past, the current event chairs who made this chapter so successful. This is one of our newer chapters, but it's already one of the most active and fruitful, so thank you all for making that possible. The speaker at the Churchill Weekend in Fulton was Admiral Jim Storitas, who many of you know from his television appearances, his many books and articles. He's a good friend of the Churchill Society, and he happens to live in Jacksonville, so hopefully next year we get him here for an event. I can see the wheels in Gene's mind turning over already. And I also bring you greetings from our Executive Director, Justin Reich, and Ambassador Mitchell Reese, who's our new board chair. As Gene mentioned, this year is the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth, and there's a worldwide series of events in the US and UK, other countries. There'll be lots of information about that. The Churchill Society continues to thrive. I hope you are all members and get our wonderful quarterly journal of Winston Churchill Finest Hour. And if you're not members, we can fix that very, very quickly. Just go to winstonchurchill.org and please sign up. We remain very active in a whole bunch of different spheres. A fellowship program, Finest Hour that I mentioned, our Churchill Bulletin newsletter, engaged in a lot of interesting programming through our National Churchill Leadership Center in Washington, D.C. For those of you who might be interested, I'm doing an online program with them on April 17th about Winston Churchill and the American Civil War, and which is not a subject that most people recognize as being so important, but Churchill was absolutely fascinated with that, so you can sign up for that, and as I put it, it's free and I promise you'll get your money's worth. We also have a new strategic partnership with one of the oldest defense and international affairs think tanks in the world, the Royal United Services Institute in London. We're planning a whole series of programs with them, the first one coming up in May with David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, and we'll also be doing things with them in Washington. And the highlight of Churchill 150 is going to be our conference in London, October 24th to 27th, which I'm sure all of you would enjoy. You'd be more than welcome to attend. We have some wonderful speakers, some terrific venues, Lancaster House, the National Portrait Gallery, and what no Churchill conference should be without, which is a visit to London Palace. So go to winstonchurchill.org please register. We promise you, whether you've been to many conferences before or this would be your first time, you will have a very enjoyable experience, and Jean, we hope to see you there. So now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend Joe LeConte, who is a wonderful writer, an outstanding historian, and a devoted Churchillian, and not coincidentally, a presidential fellow here at New College. We're certainly lucky to have him here in beautiful Sarasota. Joe formerly taught at King's College in New York and at Pepperdine University in California. He's the author of multiple books. You've seen some of his articles in publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the National Review. And very fortunately for us, he is writing what I'm sure will be an outstanding book about Winston Churchill at the Yalta Conference. This must be my Yalta weekend because I was just with Catherine Katz, who wrote a wonderful book on that subject a few years ago called The Daughters of Yalta. So between Vladimir Putin, Ukraine, Crimea, and Joe, Yalta is very much on our minds. So please welcome Joe LeConte.
Thanks so much.
And Joe has a wonderful website, josephleconte.com. You can find out all about that.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Lee. Thank you, Gene. Can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats all right? Yeah? Good? Yes? Okay, great. Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, New College, for this event. Let's just get into it. And there's my clicker. Go back for a second here. Yeah. Shortly after the Allied invasion at Normandy, June 6, 1944, Winston Churchill sent a note to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces in Europe. I deem it highly important that we should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible. The British Prime Minister implored Eisenhower to seize the cities of Berlin, Prague, and Vienna ahead of the advancing Soviet armies, but that's not going to happen. Eisenhower doesn't believe it's a feasible military strategy. The British military historian Max Hastings agrees from his book Inferno. The Russians got to Eastern Europe first. To have frustrated their imperialistic purposes, it would have been necessary for the Western Allies to fight a very different and more ruthless war at much higher cost and casualties. The Soviets cared nothing for the preservation of civilian life or property, he writes. This was a barbarian army which had achieved things such as only barbarians could. So, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the commander-in-chief of this barbarian army is Joseph Stalin. The Russian military suffered exponentially more casualties in fighting the Nazis than did the Democratic Allies, and Stalin is determined to claim the spoils of war. Alongside him is the popular but ailing American president, Franklin Roosevelt. Mr. Roosevelt has successfully converted America's domestic economy into an arsenal of democracy, and yet his mental and physical decline will make him unprepared to challenge the ruthless and calculating man of steel, which is literally what the name Stalin means, man of steel. Caught in the middle of these two personalities is Winston Churchill. Like no other political leader could have attempted, Churchill summoned the moral resolve of the British people at their darkest hour of crisis. From 1940 to 1945, he has been the indispensable man. With regard to the Soviet Union, Churchill was among the most impassioned advocates for intervening in the Russian Revolution back in 1919 to smother the communist baby in its crib. He despises everything that Soviet communism represents. And yet here he is, dining and toasting to the good health of Marshal Stalin. With regard to the United States, Churchill possesses a deep respect for America, what he calls the Great Republic. He has great affection for the American president, but it will pain him deeply as Franklin Roosevelt marginalizes him at Yalta in order to ingratiate himself with Stalin. Listen to Churchill on this. The president is behaving very badly, he tells his staff over breakfast. He won't take any interest in what we are trying to do. What Winston Churchill was trying to do at Yalta was to preserve a measure of democratic freedom in Central and Eastern Europe. This was his overriding objective at Yalta, the last wartime conference between these three political titans. They meet from February 4th to 11th, 1945, in the city of Yalta in Crimea, southern Ukraine. They meet when victory over Germany and Japan is not yet complete, but nearly certain. They meet to decide what the new world order will look like. Now, today I want to challenge the conventional wisdom that the Soviet Union's complete absorption of Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War was inevitable. It is, of course, true that the Soviet army already occupied most of these nations before the Yalta Conference. Nothing, we are told, could alter Moscow's intention to create friendly states along the border of the Soviet Union. Nothing that happened at Yalta, we are asked to believe, could have made a difference. I disagree strongly. The combined military might of the United States and Great Britain at this political moment is daunting, while the Soviet Union is overextended and economically vulnerable. A careful reading of the transcripts of the Yalta discussion, as well as the personal diaries and letters of the participating staff, suggests that the Yalta Conference was a hinge in the history of the West. Other decisions might have been made by the United States and Great Britain working together as a united democratic front that could have seriously constrained the Soviet Union's expansionist designs. Instead, the Western allies, especially the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, ignored the true nature of the Soviet regime and the unique malevolence of its leadership. And that lack of clarity, that deficit of moral seriousness, invited the tragic results at Yalta. That's the big picture. That's the big picture today. Now, I'm not a military historian. I don't know if Eisenhower's army in France could have gotten to Berlin before the Russians. I don't know if the Allied troops in Italy could have surged northward into southeastern Europe to stymie the Soviet army. But Poland, friends, Poland is another matter. Poland is the linchpin. It was the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany in 1939 that thrust Great Britain into war. Winston Churchill is acutely conscious of the debt that Britain owes to the courage of the 150,000 Polish expatriates who fought with the British forces at Monte Cassino, the Battle of Britain, and in other theaters against the Nazis. Poland was debated at 7 out of the 8 plenary sessions, the main sessions at Yalta. Of all the issues discussed at the conference, the future of the UN, the occupation of Germany, the role of the Soviet Union in the war against Japan, the political fate of Poland becomes the most contentious, and the results, ultimately, are the most consequential. Like no other question, the debate over Poland exposed the deep ideological division submerged during the common struggle against Nazism. Let me summarize them briefly. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt. He served alongside Woodrow Wilson during the First World War, and he imbibed Wilson's dream of a democratic League of Nations that would put an end to global conflict. He is, of course, the leader of the most powerful democracy in the world. He's a political and religious progressive, supremely confident in the capacity of the national government, guided by enlightened statesmen such as himself, to solve our social and political problems. Winston Churchill is the most historically minded of the three, the defender of Great Britain's unique role in establishing the concept of individual rights and representative government in the West. Churchill's religion, though undefined, it has kind of a muscular quality to it, doesn't it? A belief in providence governing a moral universe. Joseph Stalin declared himself an atheist as a young man, and he embraced the most potent substitute religion available, Marxism-Leninism. He is a materialist to the core. Nothing could penetrate Stalin's conviction, not the Red Terror, not the catastrophic man-made famines of the 1920s and 30s, that communism was the true path to social justice. He's a true believer. The debate over Poland laid bare these philosophical differences, and it also exposed the divergent political objectives of the big three. For Roosevelt, Poland is a potential political liability, but also a means to his chief political end. What's his chief political end? Well, the establishment of a successor organization to the League of Nations, right? The United Nations, that's what he's after. He imagines that the inclusion of the Soviet Union in the United Nations will restrain and even democratize the communist state. For Roosevelt, Poland becomes a bargaining chip, a means to an end. For Churchill, Poland symbolizes the fulfillment of a moral pledge, as well as, yes, an effort to preserve a measure of British influence on the continent. Listen to Winston Churchill. "Never could I be content with any solution that would not leave Poland as a free and independent state." For Joseph Stalin, Poland represents not only security on Russia's western border, as he claims, but also the settling of an old score and the expansion of Soviet power. Let's just take a moment with that bit of Russian history, the settling of an old score. Joseph Stalin despises both the Polish state and the Polish people. His hatred had its roots in the Marxist revolution, the vision of global revolution by the Marxists. The Versailles Treaty created the Polish Republic in 1919, right? Incorporating bits of Western Ukraine, Western Byelorussia. The Soviet Union wanted these territories brought into its fold. It wanted to extend the communist revolutionary movement throughout Europe in the 1920s. Trying to exploit European exhaustion after the First World War, Vladimir Lenin ordered the Red Army to march through Poland in order to assist communists in Germany. But the Poles, friends, the Poles refused to allow their nation to become a doorway to communist aggression. They resisted and defeated the Red Army in a fierce battle outside Warsaw, sending them back to Russia in humiliation. Because Stalin oversaw that military operation, his reputation was damaged within party circles, and he never forgot it. He never forgot it. 20 years later, Stalin gets his revenge against the Polish people. The Soviet invasion and occupation of eastern Poland in 1939, coordinated, of course, with Nazi Germany, which invaded Poland from the west, the trigger event for the Second World War. This was the secret agreement in the infamous non-aggression pact signed by Hitler and Stalin. Friends, we must never forget that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, for 22 months, were political allies. For 22 months, they are allies in the war against Western civilization, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Allies in the war against the West. Russia sold oil and grain to Germany. Germany sold weapons to the Soviet Union. So, after Russia invaded Poland, it launched an all-out assault on the foundations of Polish society. 1.5 million Poles forcibly evicted from their homes in cleansing operations. Landowners, government officials, business leaders, church leaders, all rounded up. Destitute and starving people loaded into boxcars, transported deep into the Soviet interior. Hundreds of thousands died in a nightmare of captivity and starvation. What is Stalin's objective in Poland? Two events during the war should have made his intentions crystal clear to the United States and Great Britain. The first is the Katyn Massacre, an execution order signed March 5th, 1940, in Joseph Stalin's hand, his za in favor, written across the page. The other signatories to that execution order include his protege, his chief diplomat at Yalta, Mr. Molotov. The language of the order is unambiguous. The 14,700 Polish officers languishing in Soviet POW camps, they're going to be shot. Also eliminated 11,000 members of the bourgeois elite, meaning lawyers, landowners, priests, factory owners. In other words, Stalin's aim is to decapitate an entire generation of Polish leadership, keep Poland weak. The killings took place from April to May 1940 in various parts of Russia. The largest execution occurred in the Katyn Forest. The executions were systematic. Each officer was shot with a single bullet to the base of the skull. 3 years later now, 1943, after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, 4,000 bodies are discovered in a mass grave at Katyn by the advancing German army. The Germans announced the discovery in April 43, hoping to divide the Allies. Stalin, of course, denied any Soviet involvement. It was a bald-faced lie. By any definition, friends, the Katyn massacre was a criminal act, exactly the kind of war crime that Nazi officials would be charged with after the war at the Nuremberg trials. That's the first event in the war that should have signaled to the United States and Great Britain what Stalin's intentions were for Poland. The second event was the Warsaw Uprising. Just a minute on this. In the summer of 1944, after the Normandy invasion, members of the Polish underground tried to seize the city from the retreating Germans. Soviet forces pushing westward, they pause just outside of Warsaw. They watch as the Germans destroyed the Polish resistance. The United States meekly asked the Soviet Union for permission to use their air bases in Russia to drop supplies to the beleaguered Poles. Stalin refused. 40,000 Polish citizens at least massacred as the Red Army stood idle. The revolt crushed. So, the point is, this is the nature of the Soviet leadership at Yalta. This is the nature of the leadership. Stalin, Molotov, and his inner circle. Now they are at the negotiating table as an equal partner with the United States and Great Britain as they sort out the future of Europe. Poland is the crucial issue. There's the Polish democratic resistance with its leadership in London. That's one government, set against the communist puppets installed in Warsaw during the fog of war. That's the other government, two governments. The American and British negotiating teams want the Soviets to agree to a new provisional government in Poland, reorganized on broader democratic lines to offset the communist thugs in Warsaw. After that, democratic elections could be held. Let me read you a few lines from the transcript. There's a British transcript, there's an American transcript. I've got both of those. There's a Russian transcript. I don't speak Russian, but if you've got any Russian translators out there, I'm happy to take your help. All right, listen to Churchill on this. Honor was the sole reason why we had drawn the sword to help Poland against Hitler's brutal onslaught. We could never accept any settlement which did not leave her free, independent, and sovereign. Stalin and his negotiator, Mr. Molotov, attacked the political sovereignty of Poland at every turn. After initially agreeing to a new provisional government, they're now insisting that the Communist Lublin Committee, that's the communist government in Warsaw, the Communist Lublin Committee, these marionettes of Moscow, they remain in control. From the transcript, Churchill, of course, we are at the crucial point of this great conference. This is the question for which the world is waiting. Churchill insists that the Lublin government in Warsaw, quote, does not commend itself to the vast majority of the Polish people. We feel that it is not accepted abroad as representative. If we were to brush away the London government and lend all our weight to the Lublin government, this would be a world outcry. As far as we can see, he says, the Poles outside Poland would make a united protest. We have an army of 150,000 Poles who are fighting bravely. That army would not be reconciled to Lublin in Warsaw. It would regard our action in transferring recognition as a betrayal. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Franklin Roosevelt is conciliatory toward the Russians. From the transcript, Roosevelt, the United States will never lend its support in any way to any provisional government in Poland which would be inimical to your interests, he assures Mr. Stalin. You understand what he's saying? The United States will not approve of any government in Poland that Stalin doesn't like. But that's the point. A democratic government would be inimical to the interests of Stalin. The American president is prepared to give in to Stalin's demands. From the back and forth debate that extended over several days, Churchill is the most ardent defender of Poland's sovereign independence. The Prime Minister's position is clear. The final borders of Poland, yes, they're negotiable, but not its political sovereignty. From the transcript, Churchill, I want the Poles to have a home in Europe and to be free to live their own life there. That is an objective which I have always heard Marshal Stalin proclaim with the utmost firmness. He goes on. It's because I put my trust in his declaration about the sovereign independence and freedom of Poland that the frontier question I consider not of supreme importance. He'll negotiate the border, but not Poland's independence. He goes on. This is what is dear to the hearts of the nation of Britain. This is what we went to war against Germany for, that Poland should be free and sovereign. Everyone here knows the result. It was to us, unprepared as we were, and that it nearly cost us our life as a nation. It's a pretty impassioned speech at that moment. The Soviets have agreed to free elections in Poland, but now they're reneging on an earlier plan to allow international election observers into the country. International election observers. From the transcript, Roosevelt. How long before elections could be held? Stalin. In about 1 month, unless there is a catastrophe on the front and the Germans defeat us. He's smiling now. I do not think this will happen. Churchill. Free elections would, of course, settle the worries of the British government at least. Roosevelt. I want this election in Poland to be the first one beyond question. It should be like Caesar's wife. I did not know her, but they said she was pure. Stalin. They said that about her, but in fact, she had her sins. Roosevelt. I don't want the Poles to be able to question the elections. Molotov. We are afraid to leave this phrase in about election observers without consulting the Poles. They will feel it shows a lack of confidence in them. It is better to leave it to the Poles. FDR. Why not leave this for the foreign ministers and talk about this tomorrow? Molotov's statement, of course, is pure nonsense. International election observers are exactly what the Polish people want, what they deserve, given the presence and the behavior of the Russian army. But the Soviets have no intention of consulting the Polish people about this. It is purely a tactic to obfuscate and delay. Roosevelt is hoodwinked. His interventions on the Polish question at Yalta are brief and superficial. He avoids challenging any of Stalin's demands. At one point during the negotiations, Roosevelt claims that the differences between Russia and the United States and Britain over Poland's independence are, quote, largely a matter of the use of words. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, is appalled. He's there at Yalta, Anthony Eden. And in his memoir, The Reckoning, he summarizes Roosevelt's frame of mind. He was deluding himself, he says. From the transcript, Churchill. Never could I be content with any solution that would not leave Poland as a free and independent state. I want to make an appeal to Marshal Stalin, he says. We are at a great disadvantage in discussing Polish affairs, for we know very little, but must take great responsibilities. We know there are very bitter feelings among the Poles. That is why the last sentence about the election observers is so important to us. And he goes on. The US, Britain, and Russia should be observers to see that they are carried out impartially. These are no idle requests. It's not going to happen. Winston Churchill lacks the one thing he desperately needs, the clear and unconditional support of the American president. He doesn't get it. Franklin Roosevelt, convinced he needs a Polish settlement to secure domestic support for his dream of a United Nations, instructs his aides to delete the offending provision about election observers. Delete it. Now think about that. Pause and think about that for a minute. The American president, presiding over the most powerful military in the world, with unrivaled industrial might, the engine of the global economy, he will not insist upon election observers in a European state that was brutalized by both the Nazis and the Russians. What do we make of that? It's the definition of political impotence, right? The doctrine of appeasement, the iconic moment for Great Britain with Neville Chamberlain. By not guaranteeing a free and fair democratic election in Poland, the American president telegraphs a clear message to Stalin, doesn't he? The United States will not object if Poland is absorbed into the Soviet bloc. We will not object if Poland's sovereignty and independence are destroyed by Russia. Take it, we say. We are indifferent to the political fate of Eastern Europe. Take it, we say. Does any of that sound familiar, friends? Does any of that sound familiar? Well, from a transcript, Stalin. What troubles the Polish people? This is Joseph Stalin now. What troubles the Polish people? It is a great consolation that their country has been liberated by the Red Army. This has completely changed their psychology. The old resentment has completely disappeared. Now there is goodwill toward Russia. And he goes on, my impression is that the Polish people consider this a great historic holiday. The population is surprised, even astounded, that the people of the London government do not take part in this liberation. It would be hard Hard to imagine a more cynical piece of propaganda. The debate over the fate of Poland exposes the political and moral gulf separating the democracies from Stalin's Russia. Listen to Winston Churchill in his book Triumph and Tragedy. Poland has indeed become the most urgent reason for the Yalta Conference and was to prove the first of the great causes which led to the breakdown of the Grand Alliance. The brief against FDR is not only that he willingly delivered the Polish people into Stalin's hands, he also gave moral legitimacy to this deliverance of Poland, creating a counterfeit narrative of the character and the ambitions of Uncle Joe. That's what he called Stalin on the world stage, Uncle Joe, from the moment that Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. The transformation of Stalin into a champion of democratic values began. At a White House dinner, Roosevelt prodded Hollywood producer Jack Warner to make a propaganda film, Mission to Moscow. And in that 1943 movie, Stalin is portrayed as a courageous, pipe-smoking defender of the Russian people, Uncle Joe. You know, my first name's Joe. I'm an uncle. I got 4 nephews and a niece. I'm Uncle Joe. Stalin is not Uncle Joe. Well, upon his return to the United States, Roosevelt says this to Congress: I am convinced that the agreement on Poland is the most hopeful agreement possible for a free, independent, and prosperous Polish people. Now, why, friends? Why would FDR try to persuade the Americans that a paranoid and murderous dictator such as Stalin would allow free and unfettered elections in any country he controlled? Hugh Lungi, a member of the British delegation at Yalta, Hugh Lungi, here's what he said: those of us who worked and lived in Moscow knew there was not a chance in hell that Stalin would allow free elections in those countries when he didn't allow them in the Soviet Union. They knew. They had to know. They should have known. FDR's ego offers a partial explanation for his gullibility. He believed he personally could persuade Stalin to behave more like a sensible liberal Democrat, a progressive like himself. Listen to Roosevelt. I believe he, Stalin, is truly representative of the heart and soul of Russia. And I believe we're going to get along very well with him and the Russian people. Very well indeed. Roosevelt offered the American people a seductive falsehood, friends, a deception based upon a delusion underwritten by political ambition and personal vanity. And the president's health made matters worse. In Malta, on his way to Yalta, Churchill's physician, Lord Moran, interacted with Roosevelt and recorded this in his diary. This is just before Yalta. The president appears to be a very sick man. He has all the symptoms of hardening of the arteries of the brain in an advanced stage. I give him only a few months to live. He's exactly right. Gravely ill after entering his 4th term of office, Roosevelt probably heard only half of what was said during the Yalta meetings. As various historians have noted, the British diaries and memoirs bristle with complaints, especially about the president's performance. His physical decline, Roosevelt's going to die April 12th, seemed an outward manifestation of his astonishing lack of resolve at a moment of international crisis. Now, if such judgments are possible, if they're possible, Roosevelt is the wrong man. He's the wrong man for this moment in history. He's no match mentally for the man of steel. Joseph Stalin displayed a ruthlessness, a lust for domination, and a total disregard for the moral norms of a civilized society that has few rivals in the catalog of human catastrophes. Listen to Franklin Roosevelt's rationale, his justification for the way he dealt with Stalin. It is permitted in time of grave danger to walk with the devil until you've crossed the bridge. He might have kept in mind another old maxim: he who dines with the devil had better have a long spoon. What can we say about Winston Churchill? Long before the defeat of Nazi Germany was within sight, concern over Poland's political destiny became one of Churchill's major occupations. The prime minister had committed his nation to the recreation of a strong, free, independent, sovereign Poland. No wartime leader fought harder to preserve the democratic freedom of the European states. No politician had a deeper appreciation for the cultural achievements of Western civilization. and the need to defend them against totalitarianism. Churchill once described the Soviet Union as, quote, a bear drunken with victory in the East, the United States as an elephant lurching about in the West, while Great Britain was like a donkey in between them, which was the only one who knew the way home. And yet, after 6 years of war, Britain is at the point of economic exhaustion. Churchill himself is politically vulnerable. At one point during the Yalta meetings, Churchill rises to offer toast to, quote, the proletarian masses of the world. Discussion turns to the right of people to govern themselves. From the transcript, Churchill, I'm constantly being beaten up as a reactionary, but I'm the only representative president who can be thrown out at any time by the universal suffrage of my own people. I personally glory in that danger. Stalin, the prime minister seems to be afraid of these elections. Churchill, not only do I not fear them, but I am proud of the right of the British people to change their government at any time they see fit. The political principle that Winston Churchill was defending at Yalta, of course, it's at the heart of the moral divide separating the Western democracies from the communist Soviet Union. It's the principle of government by consent of the governed. Government by consent of the governed. In the Anglo-American tradition, government by consent depends upon a set of moral beliefs about the human person, about human freedom, equality, natural rights. But atheistic communism, rooted in a purely materialistic view of the human person, repudiates these ideas in theory and in practice. Well, the central question then, facing the Allied powers at Yalta, will the liberated nations of Europe be allowed to form governments of their own choosing, respecting the natural and unalienable rights of their citizens? The political leadership of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union issue a joint declaration at the conclusion of the Yalta Conference, February 11th, 1945. You got a copy of it there, folks. We're not going to read it all. Don't panic. Let me just highlight a few items from that Yalta Declaration. To foster the conditions in which the liberated peoples may exercise these rights, the three governments will jointly assist the people in any European liberated state to hold free elections. They got a special section on Poland in the declaration. They call for a provisional government reorganized on a broader democratic basis. They pledge to hold free and unfettered elections as soon as possible. That's right there in the joint declaration at Yalta. The dream of Russian cooperation with the West quickly turns into fairy dust. Almost immediately after the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Soviet Union begins to consolidate its control over the liberated nations by the Red Army. Churchill writes a series of anxious letters to President Roosevelt in the weeks after Yalta. Churchill to Roosevelt, March 13th. Poland has lost her frontier. Is she now to lose her freedom? Churchill fears he will have to report to Parliament that, quote, we are in the presence of a great failure and an utter breakdown of what was settled at Yalta, but that we British have not the necessary strength to carry the matter further, and that the limits of our capacity to act have been reached. They don't have the support of the United States. Churchill to Roosevelt, March 16th. At present, all entry into Poland is barred to our representatives. An impenetrable veil has been drawn across the scene. Churchill to Roosevelt, March 27th. Surely, we must not be maneuvered into becoming parties to imposing on Poland and on how much more of Eastern Europe the Russian version of democracy. He goes on, there seems to be only one possible alternative to confessing our total failure, he says. That alternative is to stand by our interpretation of the Yalta Declaration. It's not going to happen. There will be none of the promised democratic elections in Poland or Eastern Europe for the next 45 years. In March, just a few weeks after Yalta, FDR complains bitterly to an aide. He, Stalin, has broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta. Of course he did, Mr. President. Of course he did. Churchill to Roosevelt, March 27th. If no such unity exists in Poland, what are the prospects of success of the New World Organization, the United Nations? Is it not indeed evident we shall be building the whole structure of future world peace on foundations of sand? You can't even make this stuff up. In May, alarmed at Soviet designs on the continent, Winston Churchill actually instructs his military advisors to devise, quote, Operation Unthinkable, unquote, a plan to attack the Soviet Union. It's 3 months after Yalta. So, bring this to a close. What can we conclude from all this? Poland was at the center of this catastrophe. The onset of the Cold War, the effectual enslavement of half the population of Europe. 100 million souls exchange one totalitarian master for another. This is why Winston Churchill entitled his final volume in the history of the Second World War, Triumph and Tragedy. The tragedy, though, friends, will be undone. Here's the good news. The tragedy will be undone, and Poland will be free. Poland will become the catalyst in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It'll be a Polish Pope, John Paul II, who will help to instigate a democratic revolution in his native country that will spread throughout Eastern Europe and into the heart of the Soviet Union. As the Pope declared to crowds of over 1 million people in Victory Square in Warsaw, June 1979, here's what he said: "To Poland, the Church brought Christ, the key to understanding that great and fundamental reality that is man," he said. "The exclusion of Christ from the history of man," he said, "is an act against man. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland." Well, those words inspired democratic leaders such as Lech Walesa, who launched the Polish Solidarity movement that brought the Polish communist government to its knees. Poland, friends, Poland was the match that lit the flame of human freedom in 1989. 1989, the year of the century, the year when every East European nation cast off its communist masters and charted a democratic future, and Poland led the way. Poland. In November 1989, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Lech Walesa traveled to Washington and addressed a joint session of Congress. He began his speech with 3 words: "We, the people." We, the people. His words seem to echo through the ages, to stir something deep and noble within the human heart, to give us a glimpse of the world as it was meant to be. And he went on, "I do not need to remind anyone here where these words come from." Well, today, friends, more than ever, we need to be reminded. And that's what historians do. That's what this academic community here at New College is attempting to do. We need, in the words of the Oxford professor, C.S. Lewis, intimate knowledge of the past. Why? Because a fair-minded account of our history, our achievements as well as our failings, can inoculate us, that's the word, inoculate us from what Lewis called the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of our age. He said that in 1939, the cataract of nonsense. It has grown into a catastrophic cancer. History is remembering, isn't it? History is remembering. And memory is the gateway to gratitude. And no other quality is in greater demand today in the political life of the West. So, what will it be for us today, in this place, at this moment? Triumph or tragedy? The choice is in our hands. Thank you for listening. And I think we've got some time for questions. Yes?
Questions and answer questions?
Excellent talk. History, part of my nature. My father's Polish.
Mine too.
Oh, the brave Poles.
Yeah. And this is Yogi Berra's famous quotation, "Deja vu all over again." And he was prophetic. If you don't read history, you repeat it. How do you see this playing out with Putin? I know it's not easy.
It's a terrific question, and it's Dr. Sadler. That's a terrific question. I'm an historian, not a political strategist, so I'm out of my depth all the time, but especially on questions like that. Part of the reason I emphasize some of these points, of course, I'm mindful of what's going on. We're all mindful of what's going on in Ukraine. And it seems to me that the only language that Vladimir Putin understands is force. That's all he understands is force. And that's where we were in 1945. And without having a united democratic front, this is the point I wanted to emphasize. I think because Roosevelt would not at Yalta make it very clear to Stalin, the United States and Great Britain are in this thing together to defend Eastern Europe, particularly Poland at this moment. He didn't convey that, he conveyed the opposite. So if we convey democratic weakness right now, the United States, with regards to our European friends, I just think Putin is viewing that as its weakness, its weakness, its weakness. And literally, you know, we've had one presidential candidate even say, just go take it. Whatever Putin wants to do, just let him take it. We've heard that language, right? So we have that going on out there, whatever you think of the person's policies. So that's telegraphing the wrong message, it seems to me, to an autocrat, a brutal dictator who has a lust for power. And I'm not sure what's going to stop him. Thank you for that question.
Again, I'd like to say what a terrific presentation. Very, very good.
Thank you.
Could I go back to an early statement that you made when you were talking about 45, the strength of Britain, the strength of the United States,
Yeah.
the weakness necessarily of Russia. Do you feel, though, that Britain and the United States had the will to continue? Britain had been at war for 6 years. Was there that political will to continue?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. Think about this. What surprises me is what happens with the change in leadership when Franklin Roosevelt dies in April. Harry Truman comes on board. Within a few years, we're in a war in Korea. We had the will. Harry Truman had the will to launch a Berlin airlift. And every day, about every 2 minutes, landing in a West Berlin airfield, American planes and British planes are delivering food and fuel from the air, keeping West Berlin alive. It went on for the better part of a year until Stalin backed down. We had the political will then, with different leadership. We didn't have it with Franklin Roosevelt. I think we certainly had it with Winston Churchill. As you guys know, he was voted out of office at that moment. So that was a whole nother story, because he belonged to a constitutional government, system of government, and he could be voted out of office. So we had the political will as soon as Franklin Roosevelt died. At that moment, we didn't have it, it seems to me. Great question.
I think my question builds a little bit off of that, but I was curious what advice, you sort of threw out Operation Unthinkable at the end, but
Yeah.
didn't tell us very much about it.
Yeah.
I do wonder what advice Churchill received from his military planners, because I think my assessment is sort of similar to that of the other questioner. I think you've made a very strong moral case here, and on moral grounds I agree with you. On sort of the practical question of what the Allies could have done in 1945, and specifically, could they have brought their domestic publics around in 1945 to continue the war for a couple more years? Sorry, a couple more years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of casualties more against a power that they had been telling their publics was their ally.
That's right.
For the previous 4 years.
That's right.
I mean, morally, I think you make a very strong case. Practically, I'm not sure that's how it works.
Yes, excellent points, sir, excellent points. I basically agree with you. Operation Unthinkable was unthinkable. Churchill's military planners they shouted him down. They just shouted him down. It was on the table for about 2 weeks, I think, and they shouted him down. The American people would not have wanted to wage a war against the Soviet, not at that point. They still had to defeat Japan. And we were not willing to expend the kinds of casualties in a land invasion of Japan. Of course, we used the atomic bomb instead. There would have been no stomach for a fight against the Soviet Union. And for the part of the point you just made, Stalin's been Uncle Joe. He's been our ally. And let me walk into the world of both Stalin, I can't walk in the world of Stalin very well, thankfully. Work into Churchill's world and into Franklin Roosevelt's world a little bit more sympathetically. 6 years of war. No one wants to get into another conflict now. Stalin has been an ally, and Soviet troops are dying at the rate of 20-1 compared to what the Allies are actually losing against the Germans, right? So there's a sense of, we've been in this thing together. Stalin's people have suffered grievously, okay? They were allies with Nazi Germany, okay, we get that, but they're not anymore. So you can understand why they are toasting each other. They want so much to believe that Stalin can be moderated. And if I was in their shoes, I'd probably want the same thing. And it just wasn't reasonable to think it was going to happen. George Kennan, I think, is very good on this, our diplomat at the Soviet Union. He gets this really well in his book on the Cold War. It was just not rational to really believe Stalin was going to moderate his behavior, especially once the Red Army had occupied so much of Eastern Europe. But Poland was salvageable. That's the point I'm trying to make today. And think about it. If we had held on to Poland as a democratic state, right in the heart of Europe, who knows what democratic revolutions that might have inspired in the 1940s and 1950s, just as Poland did in the 1980s. The 1989 revolution might have happened a lot earlier. We'll just never know. One of those great what ifs. Thanks for that question. That was a terrific question.
You mentioned that FDR was using perhaps Poland as a bargaining chip for the UN. Did the Japanese conflict have any plan in that? Was there anything in the transcript about FDR trying to get Stalin involved?
Yes. Yes, absolutely right. Extremely important. It's important to Franklin Roosevelt to get Stalin's agreement, throw the Red Army, like the Red Army's been fighting the Nazis, throw them into the Japanese as well, if we've got to do a land invasion thing. Absolutely. He wants Stalin's commitment, and he gets it. In the end, he's not going to need it, right? Because of the atomic bomb. But that's part of the negotiating strategy that FDR is undergoing. Right. Get Stalin to join the United Nations, moderate his behavior to the UN, and get him to join in the fight against the Japanese. Poland is expendable. I think when you read the transcripts pretty closely, you see that that's Franklin Roosevelt's outlook. Poland is expendable. Eastern Europe is expendable. We've got to get the United Nations. That somehow will bring about a new world order.
Well, I did take a course on this once at New College. I'm an alumni, and I took a course
wow.
on the Cold War from Justice Donaghy.
Wow.
It brings back memories.
Wow.
But I guess the usual excuse for Yalta and Roosevelt is that he had he had an election coming up, and he wanted to make it look good for Poland. But the American troops weren't going to get there. I mean, they did.
Yeah.
The Russians made it
Yeah.
to Berlin.
Yeah.
Berlin is west of Poland, so there's no way we could
Yes.
get to Poland.
Yes.
So this was all just words. This was all just words.
Here's the.
But
Go
I
ahead.
have another question.
No, good point. Go ahead.
What do you think will happen? I mean, when I went to Poland a few years ago, the Poles really liked Americans.
Yeah.
This is one country that really liked Americans.
Yeah.
And the Russians who were at the same conference were not so happy about this. What do you think will happen to Ukraine in 10 years? Will the Ukrainians like Americans?
I'm not a good prognosticator, but I do want to take your point. Thanks for those questions. I want to take this point, though, about what we might have done in Poland. Think about Germany. I mean, think about Berlin. We divide up the city of Berlin into east and west. The Americans, the British, the French control the western sectors. Berlin is deep into German territory, occupied by the Soviets. How did that happen? We exerted our political will at that moment. We were not going to let them take all of Berlin, and we simply insisted. And so my argument is we should have insisted on election observers in Poland. That, to me, was a sign of complete impotence and lack of political will and courage. But I can't really prognosticate 10 years from now. I can absolutely see, though, I keep mixing up Putin and Stalin. I shouldn't do that. It's hard to see where his ambitions are going to end. And I think the other thing that's really worth thinking about is this alliance between Putin and China and Iran. I mean, those three, if there's another axis of evil brewing out there, it's those three nations right now brewing, just as the Japanese, the Nazis, and the Italians back in the 1940s. We've got another axis of autocratic, brutal regimes with either regional or global, maybe not global ambitions, China maybe more so, but all absolutely dead set against, hell-bent against the United States and democratic values. Russia, China, Iran, and their allies. That's worrisome. That's a very worrisome development right now.
Joe, when is your book coming out?
I've been doing the book in fits and starts. So I think what we may see first, I've been kind of mulling different things like, there's a great play that should come out first. Test the theory in a New York theatrical play, turn it into a film, and then write the book along the way. We'll see. Stay tuned.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks, Chair. So I had some friends in what I guess is now the previous Polish government, and I can tell you that there is a very strong sense that the Polish government not at all considered. It was basically sidelined during the discussions over
Yeah.
Eastern Europe and World War II.
Yes.
And in particular, it's a very talented diplomats running around the globe.
Yes.
But given that they were all in London, do you think that Churchill could have made better use of the Polish government in exile in trying to push his case, particularly against FDR?
That's a really terrific, perceptive question. I'm going to have to study it more closely. I think there's this. There was this frustration, as you probably know. Churchill had a frustration with the Poles in London. He felt that they were being unreasonable on the border question. And by insisting on this portion of the eastern border in Poland, he felt like they're going to destroy their own freedom, and that Stalin will just march right in and take everything, because they were not negotiable on the border question. But you look at it from the perspective of the Poles in London. Why should they sacrifice their border? That's where their homes are. That's what they're fighting for, right? And Churchill, it's difficult. He's caught between the Poles in London and the political realities. Not having the backing of the American president, though, I think is crucial on this. So could he have made better use of the Poles? Yes, but he's got to get the American president on board, and FDR has no interest in the Poles in London, does he? Almost zero interest in the democratic forces there, almost zero. That's a problem. Lack of democratic unity at a moment of political crisis. And Stalin, he's a devil, but he's a charming devil. He knows exactly what he wants. He was the man of steel. And he gets virtually everything he wants, right?
Well, Professor LeConte, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to not only thank you, but we have a present for you.
Oh, my goodness.
Our chapter would like to give you a brand new copy of the just published David Reynolds book that those of you who were with us earlier this year, we had a live talk, as I mentioned, and that's a copy for you
that's
for
terrific.
your wonderful insights. And I must
Thank you,
say
Gene.
personally,
Thank you.
this was the finest lectures about Winston Churchill I've ever attended. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gene. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. This has been a wonderful time and lots of really good questions. For those of you who want to go to the cafeteria